Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a Caseware webinar. We've had a little break from webinars over the summer, but we are back, so it's good to be back. And we are kicking off our new season of webinars with dynamic tables. This is predominantly in Cloud Financials, although it does feature in occasionally in Cloud Audit. So if we just jump to the next slide, I'll just get some introductions and some other housekeeping out of the way. So I'm Tom Jeffrey, the Senior Education and Media Technician at Caseware UK. I'll be keeping an eye on the webinar today and making sure that everything runs smoothly, also monitoring your questions, and we'll do a bit of housekeeping in a sec about how you can submit those. And I'm joined by Phil Reeves, Senior Professional Services Consultant at Caseware UK, and Phil's going to take you through the content and be on hand to answer any questions that you have. If we just jump to the next slide, you hopefully will know all about this by now, but to submit your questions you can use the Q&A option at the bottom on the toolbar, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. We'll see how we're doing for time. At the end, if we have time, we'll answer some questions live, and if we don't get back to you live, don't worry, we'll email you after the session, and we'll also include any questions in a Q&A document that we'll publish on the knowledge base, and the Q&A document will accompany the recording of the session as well, so that will be on the knowledge base. We'll also upload it to our YouTube channel, and we'll signpost our YouTube channel a bit later on. So that's the housekeeping out of the way. I'll hand over to Phil, and we'll start with the agenda.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. As Tom mentioned, today we'll be looking at dynamic tables. So we'll be looking at a few things, mainly around, again, introductory webinar. So editing dynamic tables, how some of the editing options that we have available to adjust, things we need to be aware of if we are going to go and start to edit dynamic tables. We're going to start off just by explaining what a dynamic table is for anyone who's not familiar with the uses of the dynamic tables and how they populate into the financial statements. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, please let us know. We are hoping to follow this up with a separate webinar where we'll look at more about how to build a custom dynamic table from scratch. This one's more about how we edit the existing ones that are available within the files. But you know, the skills that we're going to discuss in today's webinar will be consistent with the skills that you can use on building a new dynamic table. And again, as we go through, we'll give you some tips and tricks of what we recommend for as a training team on what to do when you are building these dynamic tables into the software. So that's enough of this PowerPoint presentation. You can all see the agenda, so we will jump in straight into Caseware. There we go. Hopefully you can see that on the screen. So yeah, just in a standard FRS 102 set of financial statements today for this webinar to, as I say, run through dynamic tables. And to start with, again, before you look to edit a dynamic table, it's important to have an understanding of what a dynamic table is. Dynamic tables are essentially any table built into the Cloud Financials or, in theory, Cloud Audit lead schedules. So any Cloud Financials table that you see in your financial statements, whether that's balance sheet, statement of comprehensive income, the notes to the accounts, they are all dynamic tables. It's the way that Caseware is able to present the information that you import through the data tab on your Caseware files. So obviously you import the data, that will populate the appropriate map numbers, that then feeds through to our dynamic tables in Caseware. So anyway, if we go to a statement of comprehensive income, this is a dynamic table. If we go down to statement of changes in equity, again, a dynamic table. And again, what we're going to look at in today's webinar is just some examples of some of the editing options that we have available within our dynamic tables, just to, you know, assist with or edit the existing disclosures if you need to. And to do that, I'm going to start by just going down to one of the notes, and we're going to look at tailoring, just a note, adding additional rows in if we want to, how we can add additional columns if we want to into these tables as well. And again, we're going to talk about some of the implications, best practice as we do so, just so that you're aware of what to keep an eye out for when you are, or if you are editing the dynamic tables. So for this example, again, I'm going to use quite a basic example. It's introductory webinar. So we're going to use the example of a debtor's note, and we're going to split prepayments and accrued income between two separate codes. As you can see, we've got quite a large figure for prepayments and accrued income. So I just want to explain how we might go about inserting an additional row and editing that dynamic table within the software. And those skills, as I said, that we'll highlight can be used across any of the Caseware content within the Caseware Cloud. So first things first, obviously, when we're navigating through to our dynamic table using the documents map, each item and each note is its own separate area within the Cloud Financials template. So if I want intangibles, if I want debtors, I can't scroll up and down. It'll only scroll up and down the individual note that I'm in at any given stage. If you are looking to amend a dynamic table, the recommendation from the Caseware training team obviously is where possible we would stick to the standards, but obviously you wouldn't be on this webinar if you weren't looking to edit the dynamic tables. So the recommendation from Caseware is that, or from the training team, is that if we are going to edit a dynamic table, first thing you want to do is go to the three dots button, and I'll just zoom out slightly so we can see all of the options. And we do suggest from a training side that we take a copy of that dynamic table before we make any amendments to it. The main reason for that is that whilst we can revert to template default, which if we do make any changes and make a mistake, we can revert back to the standard within Caseware. You know, we don't, if we're going to change quite a lot of stuff on this dynamic table, we don't necessarily want to lose what we've got as a default. We can use this as a basis to view what Caseware has as a standard. So we take a copy of the dynamic table by clicking on the three dots button, the more actions button on the right hand side, copy dynamic table, press the plus icon underneath the existing table that Caseware has provided, and then we can paste that dynamic table into this particular file or underneath the existing table provided by Caseware. When you are editing dynamic tables, if you edit a dynamic table and you require, or especially when you're building custom ones, if you require the same layout elsewhere within the financial statements, that copied dynamic table can be pasted anywhere within the account. So it doesn't necessarily need to be underneath the existing table that we've already used. So it might be, for example, that we are tailoring both the debtors due within 1 year and the debtors due within 1 year and debtors due after more than 1 year tables. You know, rather than me editing both, in theory, I could take a copy, change one, copy the table and paste it in. But again, we need to consider tagging if we are going to go through and make these amendments. Once we've gone through and copied our dynamic table or edit an existing dynamic table, we can go to the three dots button and we can select edit dynamic table from here. This is available on any of the dynamic tables within Caseware. The main way that we know, and this is just something to be aware of when you're looking at your dynamic tables, the way that you know whether it's a copied one that is not a standard one provided by Caseware is the fact that we do have the option to delete this. Within the standard content, you do not have the option to delete a standard Caseware table within the Cloud Financials template, only to either exclude it, which will hide it in this particular file, or as you can see, revert to template default. There is no delete option. So if I go three dots and go to edit dynamic table, we're just going to look at some of the editing options that are available and how we can customize this if we want to. So once we've gone in and we've loaded up the editing dynamic table options, there's a lot of different options that we have available to us. The most obvious one, which we can also do in the previous view that we were looking at, is we can simply select one of the individual rows, change the descriptions if we want to. You know, if I don't want that to say debtors, but I'd rather it said receivables, then I can update that accordingly. It's nice and easy to go through or if I want it to say trade debtors, for example, it's nice and easy to go through and update that description, both on the edit dynamic table option, or as I said previously, in the previous view that we saw. Once you change the description, it will appear in italic within the edit dynamic table option, just to indicate to you that it has been overridden from the default provided by the Caseware software. Then this arrow icon will also indicate that as well. If we hover over the arrow icon, we can see what we can revert it back to if we want to. So it's nice and easy and clear if you do amend the default wording on any of these tables within the software. Important thing to note, and from a best practice perspective, if you are coming in and editing a dynamic table will not by default save unless you press the save button in the top right hand corner, or save and close to save the changes that you made and close this particular window. Save obviously leaves the window open, but by default there is no automatic save on here, but it can be activated if you want to by going to the cog icon over here and just enabling the auto save option. It's not something that's turned on by default by Caseware, but it is something you can include if you want to when you are working on the software. Again, just something to be aware of. Now, if we are looking to edit a dynamic table, regardless of what dynamic table that is, first thing we should always consider is whether Caseware has an alternative for what we're trying to, or has an option for what we're trying to achieve. For example, if I was trying to get a number into other debtors, I wouldn't necessarily try and force that through by changing the row or by adding my own row in. My first port of call should be to look to see why that particular line is not populating, what I need to do to populate that particular line. To assist with that, one of the other options available within the cog icon is to show the hidden items. That will show you, not so much of an issue on this table, but if we were looking at balance sheet, income statement, things like that, there are often a number of hidden rows that aren't included by default because of the fact that they're not required based on the information you provided. Therefore, it might be worth showing the hidden items as well by ticking on the box over here on the left-hand side within the cog icon. We can undo any changes that we've made by clicking on the undo button at the top as well. So if you do make a mistake, either undo or just press cancel. If you cancel the changes that you've made, that will just take it back to whatever the table looked like prior to you making that adjustment. Now, in terms of editing the table itself, we can add additional columns in should we need to, using the plus icons at the top of the screen here. Adding an additional column will automatically add a current year column into the table. So in theory, at this stage, we'll have 2 current year columns. We can adjust that type of column though using the icon or the options that are available over here. So we've got the type, and it might be actually that we want a note reference column. If we're going to reference this to another note, for example, where we might have a breakdown of certain pieces of information, then we might add that in. So we can select note reference, and you'll see Caseware will automatically give us the hashtags which we can use to reference to another note once we have built our or once we've saved our changes and gone back to the standard mode or view within Caseware. One that might be useful, again, if you were building your own tables, which we, again, will have a follow-up webinar where we build a custom table from scratch. But percentage variances might be useful, especially if you're building or looking to adjust the lead schedules that are, or build your own lead schedules within the audit template, where we can go through and add amount or percentage variances. Alternatively, if you're doing like a KPIs table within a director's report or strategic report, more likely, then you could have a column on the right-hand side that is for the percentage variance, which will do a comparison. If I just show you between the current year figure and the prior year figure, automatically without you having to make any changes to this particular row. Now, if you don't like exactly where that has been added, because it will add to the left-hand side of whatever column you select. So or in terms of this one, we'll add between 2025 and 2024. This plus icon adds after 2025. This one adds before 2024. If you add it into the wrong place but want to move it, easy. You can drag and drop to move your columns around if you want to. Nice and easy if you're going to do that. If you're working on it and you think, actually, I might not need that in this particular file, but I wouldn't suggest you delete it. Always press the eye icon and hide this column, which will hide the column that you've done. I'd especially do that if you were editing an existing table for whatever reason, if you needed to remove a prior year column, for example. Never delete one of the standard columns within Caseware. Again, best practice tip. Always use the eye icon to hide it, because if there is an event that you need to bring it back in, obviously you can revert to template default, but if you've made amendments, reverting to template default will revert the whole table back to the standard Caseware version. Whereas obviously if we select the eye icon, we can come back in and we can show it again at a later point. If we are going through and creating a dynamic editing a dynamic table, one of the other things we might want to do is add a heading at the top. So instead of just having 2025, we might want to add some additional narrative on our column header. We can do that using the header option here. So it could be, year ended, just for the sake of argument. We can add that into there if we want to, rather than having just 2025 up there. Only thing to note on there using that header option is it only affects the table that you're on. It doesn't affect all of the tables within the financial statements because obviously we're only editing this one table. Only other thing to note is if you are adding an additional column in, Caseware will not automatically select this option to display zero balances. So again, as a best practice recommendation, if you are going to add an additional column into the table and you want dashes where there are zeros, then we do suggest that you tick this box because, as I said, if you add a new column in, this is not selected by default, which obviously can cause issues when you go through and or will result in it basically looking different to the rest of the table. It's not consistent. You can see here there's no dashes, but if I select this option, now we've got dashes coming through on this particular column. So as well as adding an additional column in, we can also use the plus icons on the left hand side, to add additional rows in. Nice and easy. And in this example, I'm just going to add an additional row in for prepayments and accrued income to separate those two out. So the first thing I'd do is adjust the heading for prepayments and accrued income. I'm going to call that prepayments. Then we're going to go to the plus icon to add an additional row in. So when you're editing or building a dynamic table, there are 6 different types of rows that you can include when you're adding an additional row in. One is a trial balance data row, which will allow us to populate information directly from the trial balance. Input row pretty much does what it says on the tin. You can input figures into there, but then you can also populate from mapping if you want to, or you can populate from other areas of the financial statements. Commentary row, just for some additional text, some commentary, you're commenting on what is above. Spacing row, if you ever need to add additional space, if you're not happy with the spacing between rows within Caseware, add a spacing row within the table. Page break, again, pretty self-explanatory. And a custom group, which in this example I wouldn't use, but if you were building a dynamic table from scratch, as again we will do during our follow-up webinar, the custom group will allow you to acquire a heading at the top and a subtotal at the bottom. So you do, anytime we're building a custom table from scratch, we would always start with a custom group. That will give us, as I say, the bold heading at the top, the subtotal at the bottom. We don't necessarily need to keep both of those, but if you ever need a bold subheading in a table, a custom group is what we would use. In this case, I'm going to insert an input row so I can show you some of the different options that we've got when we have an input row added into an existing table. So we press add input row. And as you can see, that'll automatically give us a new row available within our table. Now, when it comes to populating these rows, we have a couple of different options. Obviously, we can manually type in the heading, as you would probably do in most cases. You can populate this via the FX button, which is a formula button, which we'll come back to in a minute, but it's much easier just to type this in on your dynamic tables. When it comes to populating the balances, as I've already mentioned, there's a couple of different options that are available to you. You can manually type the balance in, but from the if we're looking at this from the purposes of producing these accounts year on year on year, we don't necessarily want to be typing balances in, because if we're manually typing them in, then next year the chances are, again, we're going to need to manually type that in, and also remember that we've typed that balance in. So where possible, if we can, we want to populate via mapping or via another location within the financial statements. And to do that, if it's an input row, we would use the FX button. When we select the FX button, we get this calculation field underneath. And within the calculation field, we can either type a number in manually, just by literally typing in a number, which is basically the same as selecting this 1, 2, 3 button. We can add together numbers either by typing them in, or we can add map numbers or numbers that we're getting from a calculation together. We can subtract them, we can multiply, we can divide. And again, this would be especially useful if we're building a custom note like a key performance indicators table, where we want to potentially calculate something like certain margins, or gross asset margin or something, or net asset margin. If we want anything like that, then we could use that division option as well. Just to populate from mapping, we use the FX button. That will allow us to insert a data link. That data link can come from a trial balance code, so you can populate directly from one of your nominal accounts, or, as is more likely, populate from one of the map numbers. When you select trial balance, you can search at the top for a specific code if you want to. You can change the source, current document, trial balance. They both load roughly the same thing. The main difference is the balances that show when you select trial balance it will only highlight the numbers that are pulling directly from the trial balance. Whereas the current document will round those balances as per the standard or the rest of the account. So if we're rounding to thousands, this will also round to thousands as well. Now, if we scroll down and just select our accrued income line, all we do is we expand the mapping to the code that we want to pick up. Accrued income is here, so I would select that particular code, and that will pull through into our line here. So accrued income is now populated on its own line. We do need to repeat that process for the prior year, so Caseware will not automatically populate the prior year, but as you can see, it's really straightforward, especially if we use the search function. So now what we've got is our own line included in the financial statements with that additional piece of information. Now, one thing to note is if you are editing a dynamic table, it doesn't automatically take that amount that you've separated, or the amount you've inserted is automatically being added to the subtotal at the bottom, especially if you're editing the notes to the accounts. So our subtotal now is including the 104,200 twice, because that is still being included as part of prepayments. So in that case, we would need to go and amend the prepayments calculation using the FX button. So we select FX, it shows us what's populating by default. We could just go through and subtract. So I'll just show you a couple of options. We could subtract the accrued income amount, which will get us down to the right figure. Or when you select the FX button, you can remove the existing calculation, go to the FX button and select the alternative figure that you want to pull through. Again, ultimately, they both pop out with the same figure. So we're all good to go at that stage. Now, once that's done, we can press save to save the changes that we've made. Again, if you've got auto saved enabled, then that will save automatically. But again, you'll need to press close just to show you if I have auto save. You see, I just press close at the bottom. It is currently saving those changes. So I'll just give that a second to save those changes through. Whilst they're saving, just another couple of options you have on editing dynamic tables. If you want to sort the rows within that dynamic table, it's really easy to do. You just drag and drop them up and down exactly where you want them. So you can reorder any of the dynamic tables within the financial statements. If you want to go through and add any underlines in, you can do that via the three dots button, the more actions button that's available on each row. And you can change the layout that is included on any of these rows as well. By default, obviously the subtotal at the bottom will have a double underline underneath it, but we could, if we want to, add additional underlines in as well within the table. So as I say, because I've applied the autosave, I can just press close to change that or to review and view that change that I've made on my table. So we can see that in here. Now, the one thing that I've mentioned a couple of times when it comes to editing dynamic tables is that you need to take into consideration the tagging. Any time that you edit an existing dynamic table, the new row that you've inserted will not be automatically tagged by Caseware. So you will need to use the XBRL button to go through and manually tag any of these areas if you are customizing them. If it's a custom note as a whole, obviously the entire note may need to be tagged. But if it's just inserting an additional row, then in theory, in this example, all we would need to tag is the accrued income row, because prepayments, trade debtors is automatically tagged within the Caseware template. The tagging is available within the XBRL button at the top of the screen. And we won't go through that in too much detail in today's session, but if you want to see a webinar on the XBRL options, then just let us know and we can run that as well as a follow-up. Now, in terms of editing the dynamic tables, as well as what we can see within that edit option, there are additional options available within the cog icon on the document settings. So if I go to document settings, we've got a number of different options to be aware of. Firstly, if I go into the document print settings, you can see I have the option to, sorry, that's not the right one. Let's go to the three dots button. No, print settings. There we go. So yeah, if I'm editing a dynamic table and I want to make it landscape, for example, we've got the page settings at the top where we can go through and switch any page or particular note within the financial statements to landscape if we want to. So again, that will automatically just flip that one note into a landscape format. Alternatively, again, if you find that the note is landscape and you want to flip it back to portrait, then you can obviously deselect the slider for the landscape option. Obviously, that would mainly apply if you're going to insert a number of different columns that's going to spread that across, or that makes the table too wide for a single portrait page. Okay, now, as I say, inserting rows, inserting additional columns is something that is available across the standard notes within Caseware, but can also be used if you're inserting your own dynamic tables into the Caseware file. So again, I said about key performance indicators being an example. You can do so. If I was in the strategic report, I could go to the plus icon here and add a new dynamic table into an existing section, or add my own dynamic table from scratch. If you do that, then you can use the three dots button again to edit that dynamic table and build some additional content into said dynamic table. If you want to see us build a whole dynamic table, this is where I leave it on a cliffhanger. If you want to see us go through the process of building a dynamic table from scratch, talk about custom groups, populating from other areas of the financial statements, we could use a KPI example, then just let us know. Myself and Tom will be more than happy to run a building a dynamic table webinar. Yeah, I left that as an option for everyone. If that's something that you want to see, then please feel free to just shout to us. And with that being said, I'm just wary of time and whether we've got any questions. So what I'll do is I'll hand back to my esteemed colleague, Tom Jeffrey, and we will answer any questions you've got.
Thanks, Phil. All quiet in the Q&A at the moment, actually, but you can continue to use that option while we do the wrap-up. Any questions that you submit now, we'll monitor those. We'll reply to those, should I say, after the session, and we'll also put them into a Q&A document. I think we're probably going to have to do that follow-up dynamic tables webinar now that you've set the precedent for that, because it sounds like it's a bit of a no-brainer. But we'll but certainly put your feedback in the Q&A as well as any questions. You'll also have a survey which will pop up, because we all have surveys. There's a survey that will pop up after the session where you can rate the webinar, but you can also put in any ideas for things that you'd like to see in future sessions, and that will really help us to shape our webinar schedule. So we are just going to jump to the next slide, and I'm just going to breeze through some signposting and some plugs for various things so that you know where to go for different content. So Phil, if we could just jump to the next slide. I can't actually remember what it is. It's just again reiterating about questions. So you may have gone to our website for this session, so you probably already know where this is, but our webinar schedule is posted on our events page. That's so caseware.com/UK, and then you'll have resources at the top, and then under events we have our webinars. We've got, as I say, a new season that we're diving into now. Keep an eye on that page. We'll be adding some more over the next few weeks and months. Certainly lots of webinars to do with our cloud solutions, and any suggestions that you have we'll consider when we're shaping the rest of the schedule as well. If we jump to the next slide, I'm going to very quickly breeze through this because I am slightly waffling. Client Services Caseware UK is our YouTube channel. So if you go there and do the usual YouTube stuff, subscribe, set your notifications, you'll be notified when new videos are added, such as the recording of this session. We've got a playlist for webinars, but we have lots of other playlists for bite-sized quick vid guidance on particular topics, including dynamic tables. And then finally, I believe it's finally, if you go to our knowledge base, that's at my.caseware.com, you can view articles that cover things like webinars and Q&A documents, but also we have our knowledge base bite-sized articles for solutions to particular things that you're trying to do, and you can access most of that content without logging in. You can log in, or if you have the credentials to log in, you can access things like downloads, but certainly to digest the content to help you use our products, majority of that is available without logging in. So, thank you very much for joining the webinar today. We hope you enjoyed it. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.